My name is Marcus Sullivan. I'm 38 years old, and I've spent the last 15 years serving as a staff sergeant in the United States Marine Corps. I've been deployed to 3 different countries, earned 2 Purple Hearts, and led men through situations that would break most people. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for standing outside St. Catherine's Chapel on a cold October morning, watching my own family bar me from my mother's memorial service. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The security guard, a man I'd never seen before, stood blocking the entrance with his arms crossed. Behind him, through the stained glass windows, I could see the soft glow of candles and the silhouettes of people I once called family. My sister Rebecca emerged from the doorway, her black dress pristine, her face cold as winter stone. She looked me up and down with disgust, her voice cutting through the morning air like a blade. "You're not welcome here, Marcus. Mom wouldn't have wanted you here either." The words hit harder than any shrapnel I'd ever taken. I stood there in my dress blues, medals gleaming on my chest, holding a folded flag that had draped my mother's casket during the military honors ceremony the day before. A ceremony I realize now that none of them had bothered to attend. But what happened next changed everything. As I turned to leave, accepting defeat one more time, I heard the sound that would forever be etched in my memory. The synchronized footsteps of 12 Marine Honor Guards marching in perfect formation down Maple Street, their white gloves gleaming in the sunlight, their faces stone-cold serious. The lead guard approached me, saluted sharply, and spoke in a voice that carried across the entire church grounds. "Staff Sergeant Sullivan, we're here to escort you to pay your final respects to your mother, Maria Elena Sullivan, who served this country for 32 years as a military nurse." I watched Rebecca's face drain of color. The security guard stepped aside without a word. And for the first time in 3 years, I walked through those chapel doors, not as the family disappointment, not as the black sheep, but as a son honoring his mother with the dignity she deserved. I never imagined my life would bring me to that moment outside the chapel, but the seeds of that confrontation were planted long before my mother drew her last breath. To understand how a family can fracture so completely, you have to go back to the beginning, back to when the Sullivan name still meant something in our small town of Cedar Falls, Michigan. My mother, Maria Elena Sullivan, was a force of nature disguised as a soft-spoken woman who barely reached 5 feet tall. She enlisted in the Army as a combat medic when she was just 19, back when women weren't supposed to be anywhere near the front lines. But Mom had a way of ending up exactly where she needed to be, whether it was official or not. She served 2 tours in Vietnam, 3 in the Gulf War, and countless deployments to places whose names she never spoke aloud at the dinner table. When she finally came home for good, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had seen the worst of humanity and chose to focus on healing instead of breaking. She met my father at the VA hospital, where she worked as a civilian nurse. He was a construction worker who'd never left Michigan, but he loved her fierce independence and never once asked her to dim her light for his comfort. Growing up, our house was different from the others on Elm Street. Mom kept her combat boots by the front door, polished and ready, long after she'd retired. She woke every morning at 0500, made her bed with hospital corners, and never, ever let us forget that freedom wasn't free. She taught us to respect the flag, to stand for the anthem, and to understand that service to something greater than yourself was the highest calling a person could answer. Rebecca, my older sister by 4 years, absorbed these lessons differently than I did. While I saw honor and sacrifice in Mom's stories, Rebecca saw absence and abandonment. She never forgave Mom for missing her high school graduation because of a deployment. She never understood why Mom chose to answer the call to serve over and over again when she could have stayed home and been a normal mother. Our younger brother Daniel fell somewhere in the middle, always the peacekeeper, always trying to smooth over the tension that seemed to follow Rebecca like a shadow. He became a teacher, married his college sweetheart, and settled into the kind of predictable suburban life that made everyone comfortable. He was safe, stable, everything Mom's military life had not been. Then there was me. From the time I could walk, I wanted to be like Mom. I wanted to serve, to matter, to be part of something bigger than the small-town life that felt suffocating to my restless spirit. When I announced at 17 that I was enlisting in the Marines, Mom didn't celebrate. She sat me down at our kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours earlier. "Son," she said, her voice carrying the weight of decades of experience, "this life will ask everything of you. It will take pieces of your soul you didn't even know you had. It will cost you relationships, opportunities, and comfort. Are you sure you're ready to pay that price?" I was cocky, invincible, 18 years old, and convinced I knew everything about everything. "I'm ready, Mom. I want to serve like you did." She nodded slowly, and I saw something flicker in her eyes that I wouldn't understand until years later. It was pride mixed with fear, hope tangled with regret. "Then I'll support you. But promise me something, Marcus. Promise me you'll never forget who you are underneath that uniform. Promise me you'll come home to yourself no matter where this path takes you." I promised, shook her hand like she was my commanding officer, and shipped out to Paris Island 6 months later. What I didn't know then was that my decision to enlist would become the first crack in our family's foundation. Rebecca saw it as validation of everything she hated about Mom's choices. Daniel saw it as inevitable, but worried about losing another family member to the military machine. And Mom, she saw it as both her greatest pride and her deepest fear realized in her youngest son. The first few years were good. I excelled in training, earned my place in an infantry unit, and deployed to Afghanistan with the confidence of youth and the backing of excellent preparation. Mom and I exchanged emails regularly. She never asked about the danger, never pushed for details I couldn't give, but her messages always ended the same way. "Come home safe. Come home whole. Come home to us." Rebecca's emails, when they came at all, were different. They were filled with updates about her life as a real estate agent, her marriage to Tom, her growing resentment that my service somehow overshadowed her achievements. She wrote about family gatherings I missed, holidays that weren't the same without me, and gradually, her tone shifted from missing me to blaming me for choosing to be absent. Daniel tried to bridge the gap. His messages were longer, filled with attempts to keep me connected to home, to make me feel like I was still part of the family even from thousands of miles away. He sent pictures of his kids, updates about his teaching career, and gentle reminders that there was a place for me in Cedar Falls whenever I was ready to claim it. But deployment changes you. The first time First lost a Marine under my command, a kid named Patterson who was only 19 and talked constantly about his girlfriend back in Ohio, something inside me shifted. The weight of responsibility, the reality of mortality, the understanding that every decision I made could mean life or death for the men looking to me for leadership, it all settled into my bones like permanent residence. When I came home on leave after that first deployment, I was different, quieter, more intense, less patient with small talk and civilian complaints. Rebecca noticed first, pointing out how I'd scan rooms for exits, how I'd flinch at loud noises, how I couldn't seem to relax even during family dinners. "You're scaring the kids," she told me one evening after I'd instinctively dropped to the ground when a car backfired outside. "Maybe you should talk to someone." Mom defended me without hesitation. "He's adjusting. Give him time. Give him space." This is what coming home looks like sometimes. But Rebecca didn't want to give me time or space. She wanted me to be the little brother she remembered, the one who could slip back into civilian life like changing clothes. When I couldn't do that, when I struggled with the transition every service member faces, she began to see me as broken, damaged, a problem to be managed rather than a brother to be supported. The second deployment was harder. We lost more people, saw more action, and I came back carrying invisible wounds that were harder to explain than the physical ones. This time, when I came home on leave, Rebecca didn't just notice the changes, she began to actively resent them. "When are you going to grow up, Marcus?" she asked during what would be our last real conversation for 2 years. "When are you going to stop playing soldier and build a real life?" I tried to explain that I wasn't playing anything, that the work I was doing mattered, that the Marines depending on me needed leaders who understood the cost of war, but she couldn't hear me anymore. Somewhere along the way, she'd decided that my service was selfishness disguised as nobility, that my choice to deploy again and again was a rejection of family rather than a commitment to duty. Mom began to change too, but in a different way. The proud Marine mother who'd raised me began to show signs of the wear that comes from worrying about a child in harm's way. She started asking more questions about my mental health, about my plans for the future, about whether I'd considered transitioning to civilian life sooner rather than later. "I'm proud of what you're doing, son," she told me during my last phone call before my third deployment. "But I'm also tired of being afraid every time the doorbell rings. I'm tired of watching the news and wondering if today's the day I'll see your face on the screen. I love you, and I support you, but I'm allowed to want you safe more than I want you to be a hero." It was the most vulnerable I'd ever heard her sound, and it scared me more than any firefight I'd been in. But I was committed, locked into a deployment cycle that seemed impossible to break, surrounded by Marines who depended on me, and a mission that felt larger than any individual desire, including my own need to be the son my family wanted me to be. When I finally came home for good, after 15 years of service, 3 deployments, and more loss than any person should carry, I expected to find the same family I'd left behind. Instead, I found strangers wearing familiar faces, and a mother who had grown small and tired in ways that broke my heart. The foundation cracks had become chasms, and I was about to discover just how deep they ran. The phone call that shattered everything came on a Tuesday morning in March. I was at Camp Pendleton, finishing up my final week of active duty, when my cell phone rang with Daniel's number on the screen. His voice was shaking, barely above a whisper, and I knew before he said the words that something terrible had happened. "Marcus, it's Mom. She collapsed at work yesterday. They rushed her to Cedar Falls General, but the doctors say her heart just gave out. She's gone, brother. She's gone." The world stopped moving. I stood in the middle of the Marine Corps base where I'd spent the last 6 months processing my discharge, surrounded by the familiar sounds of military life, and felt completely untethered from everything I'd ever known. My mother, the woman who'd survived combat zones and decades of military service, had been taken down by a heart attack while working a routine shift at the VA hospital. I was on a plane within 4 hours, still wearing my utilities because I hadn't taken time to change. The flight from San Diego to Detroit felt endless, every minute stretching like hours as I replayed our last conversation over and over in my mind. She'd called me 3 weeks earlier to tell me how proud she was that I was finally coming home for good, how excited she was to spend time with me without the constant fear of deployment hanging over our heads. "We'll have all the time in the world to catch up," she'd said, her voice warm and full of plans we'd never get to make. "I want to hear about everything, son. Everything you couldn't tell me while you were over there." When I landed in Detroit, Daniel was waiting for me at the gate. My brother looked like he'd aged 10 years in the 2 days since Mom died. His eyes were red-rimmed, his usually perfect teacher attire wrinkled and disheveled. We embraced in the middle of the terminal, both of us crying without shame, 2 grown men brought to their knees by the loss of the strongest person we'd ever known. "How's Rebecca handling it?" I asked as we drove through the familiar streets of our hometown. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. "She's angry, Marcus. Really angry. She's blaming you for not being here, for Mom dying alone, for all the years you spent deployed, instead of home with family." I felt the familiar weight of guilt settle in my chest, the same guilt that had followed me through every deployment, every missed holiday, every family gathering I'd attended through grainy video calls, instead of being physically present. Was she alone when it happened? "No," Daniel said quickly. "She was at work, surrounded by people who loved her. Her supervisor said she was laughing about something one of her patients had said, and then she just sat down and said she felt tired. By the time the paramedics arrived, she was already gone. The doctor said it was quick, painless. Her heart just stopped." But knowing Mom hadn't died alone didn't ease the guilt Rebecca was determined to heap on my shoulders. When we arrived at the family home on Elm Street, the house where I'd grown up, Rebecca was sitting on the front porch with Tom, her husband. She looked up when Daniel's car pulled into the driveway, and I saw something cold and calculating in her expression that I'd never seen before. She didn't stand up when I got out of the car. She didn't offer a hug or any of the comfort siblings typically share in moments of grief. Instead, she looked me up and down with obvious distaste and said, "Well, look who finally decided to come home. Too bad it's 3 days too late to matter." The words hit like a physical blow, but I tried to push past them. "Rebecca, I came as soon as I could. I was processing out of the Marines. I couldn't just leave immediately." "Couldn't leave immediately?" She stood up then, her voice rising with each word. "You couldn't leave immediately to be with your dying mother, but you could leave immediately for every deployment, every mission, every time the military snapped their fingers and told you to jump." Tom placed a restraining hand on her arm, but she shook him off. "She spent 15 years worrying about you, Marcus. 15 years checking the news every day, terrified she'd see your name on the casualty reports. 15 years of missed birthdays, missed holidays, missed moments because you decided playing hero was more important than being a son." I wanted to defend myself, to explain that service meant sacrifice, that the work I'd been doing had saved lives and protected freedoms. But standing there in front of the house where Mom had raised us, where she'd waited for my calls and counted down the days until my leaves, the words felt hollow. Rebecca wasn't wrong about the cost my service had extracted from our family. She was only wrong about whether that cost had been worth it. Daniel stepped between us, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "This isn't the time for this. We just lost Mom. We need to come together, not tear each other apart." But Rebecca wasn't finished. Come together? Where was the togetherness when Mom was working double shifts to pay for his college fund while he was off playing soldier? Where was the togetherness when she had to go to my wedding alone because he was deployed? Where was the togetherness when she had that car accident 2 years ago and spent 3 days in the hospital wondering if her precious Marine son even cared enough to call? That last accusation stopped me cold. What car accident? Nobody told me about any car accident. Rebecca's smile was bitter, triumphant. Of course nobody told you. Mom made us promise not to tell you because she didn't want you to worry, didn't want to distract you from your important mission. She had 3 broken ribs and a concussion, Marcus. She could have died. And she protected you from even knowing about it. The guilt crashed over me like a wave, threatening to pull me under. I thought about all the conversations I'd had with Mom over the years, how she'd always focused on my safety, my well-being, my needs. I'd never considered that she might be hiding her own struggles, her own pain, to spare me the burden of worrying about home while I was in harm's way. "I didn't know," I said quietly. "If I'd known, I would have come home. I would have been here." "Would you?" Rebecca's voice was sharp as broken glass. "Or would you have found another excuse, another reason why the Marines needed you more than your family did?" The accusation hung in the air between us, and I realized I didn't have a good answer. Had I been so committed to my service that I'd lost sight of my responsibilities to the people who loved me? Had I hidden behind duty and honor to avoid the messy, complicated work of maintaining relationships with people who couldn't understand the world I lived in? That night, sleeping in my childhood bedroom with its faded Marine Corps posters and high school trophies, I lay awake thinking about Rebecca's words. She was angry, lashing out in her grief, but there was truth mixed in with the venom. I had chosen service over family, again and again. I had missed moments that could never be recovered, chances to show love that would never come again. The next few days were a blur of funeral preparations, paperwork, and uncomfortable conversations with relatives I hadn't seen in years. Everyone wanted to thank me for my service, to shake my hand and tell me how proud Mom had been of me. But underneath their polite words, I could sense the same accusations Rebecca had voiced. Where had I been? Why hadn't I come home more often? How could I have let my mother die without being there? Rebecca took control of the funeral arrangements with the efficiency of someone accustomed to managing difficult situations. She chose the flowers, selected the readings, and coordinated with the pastor at St. Catherine's Chapel, the same church where we'd been baptized as children. But when I asked about military honors, About having a flag draped on Mom's casket to recognize her 3 decades of service? Rebecca's response was immediate and non-negotiable. Absolutely not. Mom's service was a burden she carried, not something to be celebrated. She spent her entire adult life trying to heal people broken by war, trying to fix what the military had damaged. The last thing she would want is to be remembered as a soldier, instead of as a mother, a nurse, a woman who chose healing over harm. I tried to explain that military honors weren't about celebrating war. They were about recognizing sacrifice, acknowledging service, honoring someone who had given years of their life to something larger than themselves. But Rebecca wouldn't hear it. You don't get to decide how Mom is remembered, Marcus. You weren't here. You don't get a vote. Daniel tried to mediate, suggesting we could have a small military ceremony in addition to the traditional funeral service. But Rebecca shut that down too, her voice cold and final. If you want to play soldier, do it somewhere else. This is about our mother, not about your guilty conscience. That's when I realized the depth of her resentment, the completeness of her rejection of everything my service had meant. In Rebecca's mind, my years in the Marines weren't just a career choice. They were a betrayal of family, a rejection of love, a selfish pursuit that had cost our mother years of worry and grief. But Mom had been a veteran too. She'd earned the right to be honored for her service, regardless of how Rebecca felt about mine. So I arranged for a separate ceremony at the Cedar Falls Veterans Memorial, a simple service with full military honors for a woman who'd served her country with distinction and died without ever asking for recognition. Only 3 people attended: Daniel, myself, and Sergeant Major Williams, Mom's old commanding officer who'd driven 4 hours from Grand Rapids to pay his respects. As taps played and the honor guard folded the flag that had covered Mom's casket, I felt the weight of my family's absence like a physical ache in my chest. That evening, Daniel came to my hotel room with news that made my blood run cold. Rebecca had hired a security guard for the memorial service. She'd made it clear that I wasn't welcome, that my presence would be disruptive and disrespectful to Mom's memory. She can't legally stop you from attending, Daniel said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. But she's convinced Tom and his brothers to back her up. She's going to make a scene if you show up, Marcus. She's going to turn Mom's memorial into a battlefield. I sat on the edge of the hotel bed, staring at the folded flag on the nightstand, the flag that represented everything Mom had been and everything Rebecca wanted to forget. For 15 years, I'd served my country with honor. I'd led Marines through combat, made impossible decisions under fire, and never once backed down from a fight that mattered. But this fight, this battle for the right to honor my own mother, felt different. It felt personal in a way that combat never had. Rebecca wasn't just trying to keep me from the memorial service. She was trying to erase the part of Mom that connected us, the part that understood why service mattered, why some things were worth the sacrifice they demanded. I looked at Daniel, my brother who'd spent years trying to keep our family together despite the forces pulling us apart. What would you do? He was quiet for a long moment, staring out the hotel window at the lights of our hometown. I'd go, he said finally. I'd go and pay my respects to the woman who raised us, regardless of what Rebecca thinks she can stop. Mom deserves to have all her children there, Marcus. She deserves to be honored by the people who loved her most. That night, I made a phone call that would change everything. I called Master Sergeant Rodriguez, my old platoon sergeant, who'd retired to Detroit 2 years earlier. I told him about Mom, about the memorial service, about Rebecca's ultimatum. His response was immediate and unwavering. We'll be there, Sullivan. Marines don't leave Marines behind, and we sure as hell don't let anyone disrespect a fallen veteran's memory. How many do you need? I don't need anyone to fight my battles, Rodriguez. I just need to pay my respects to my mother. This isn't about fighting battles, son. This is about honoring a Marine who gave 32 years to this country and deserves better than being hidden away like her service didn't matter. We'll be there. The next morning, as I stood outside St. Catherine's Chapel in my dress blues, watching the security guard block my path while Rebecca glared at me from the doorway, I heard the sound that would change everything. 12 sets of military boots marching in perfect synchronization down Maple Street. 12 Marines in dress blue uniforms approaching with the precision and dignity that had defined Mom's entire military career. They weren't coming to start a fight. They were coming to finish what I'd started the day I decided to honor a veteran's memory regardless of the cost. And as they drew closer, their faces stone serious and their purpose unmistakable, I realized that some battles aren't about winning or losing. Sometimes they're about standing up for what's right, even when standing up means standing alone. Master Sergeant Rodriguez stepped forward first, his weathered face bearing the scars of 3 deployments and 28 years of service. Behind him, 11 other Marines stood in perfect formation, their dress blues immaculate, their white gloves pristine against the October morning light. These weren't strangers doing a favor for an old colleague. These were men and women who had served alongside me, who understood what honor meant when the world seemed determined to forget it. Rodriguez saluted me with the crisp precision that had made him legendary among junior Marines. "Staff Sergeant Sullivan," he said, his voice carrying across the church grounds with unmistakable authority. "We're here to escort you to pay your final respects to Gunnery Sergeant Maria Elena Sullivan, United States Army, who served this nation with distinction for 32 years. The title hit me like electricity. Gunnery Sergeant. I stared at Rodriguez, confusion mixing with recognition. Rodriguez, Mom was Army, not Marines. And she retired as a staff sergeant, not gunnery sergeant. His smile was slight, but unmistakable. Check your facts, son. Your mother cross-trained to Marine Corps Medical in 1987. Served with the 2nd Marine Division for 8 years before transferring back to Army nursing. Made gunnery sergeant before her final discharge. Saved my life in Mogadishu in '93, along with half my platoon. The words hit me like a physical blow. I turned to look at Rebecca, whose face had gone pale as Rodriguez continued speaking. Your mother never told you about Somalia, did she? About the convoy that got hit? The Marines she pulled from burning vehicles? The 16 hours she worked without sleep to keep wounded warriors alive while under enemy fire? Rodriguez's voice carried the weight of memory, of gratitude that had been carried for 30 years. She earned the Navy Cross for that action, saved 14 Marines that day, including me. Rebecca stepped forward, her composure cracking for the first time since I'd arrived home. That's impossible. Mom never served in Somalia. She never mentioned any Navy Cross. She was just a nurse. Sergeant Martinez, one of the Marines I'd served with in Afghanistan, spoke up from the formation. Ma'am, with respect, Gunnery Sergeant Sullivan was never just anything. She was one of the finest combat medics the Corps ever produced. Ask anyone who served with her. I felt the ground shifting beneath my feet, everything I thought I knew about my mother rearranging itself into a different picture. Why didn't she tell us? Why didn't she ever mention Somalia, the Navy Cross transferring to the Marines? Rodriguez's expression softened. Same reason she never told you about a lot of things, Sullivan. Your mother believed in protecting her family from the weight of war. She carried those memories so you wouldn't have to, until you chose to carry your own. The security guard who had been blocking the chapel entrance stepped aside without a word, his authority meaningless in the face of 12 Marines in formation. But Rebecca wasn't finished fighting. I don't care what she did or didn't do in the military, she said, her voice rising with desperation. This is my mother's memorial service, and I decide who's welcome here. Marcus lost the right to call himself her son when he chose the Marines over family 15 years ago. That's when Daniel emerged from the chapel, and I saw something in his face I'd never seen before. Not the careful neutrality he'd maintained throughout our childhood. Not the peacemaker's desire to smooth over conflict. This was anger, raw and honest and directed squarely at Rebecca. Stop, he said, his teacher's voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention. Just stop, Rebecca. You don't get to rewrite history because you're angry. You don't get to erase what Mom was because it doesn't fit the narrative you've created. Rebecca turned to face him, surprise replacing some of the fury in her expression. Danny, you don't understand. He wasn't here. He chose them over us, over her. No, Daniel said firmly. You chose to see it that way because it was easier than accepting that Mom raised a son who inherited her sense of duty, her willingness to serve something larger than himself. You've spent 15 years punishing Marcus for being exactly the kind of person Mom taught us to be. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a letter, yellowed with age and worn from handling. Mom wrote this 3 days before she died. She asked me to give it to Marcus when he came home, but I think you need to hear it too. Daniel unfolded the letter carefully, his hands trembling slightly as he began to read in Mom's voice, her words carrying across the church grounds with the weight of final testimony. My dear Marcus, if Danny is reading this, it means I didn't get to tell you these things myself, and that breaks my heart more than I can express. I know your sister is angry with you, angry with me, angry with the choices we made. I know she sees your service as abandonment, my support of your service as favoritism. But I need you to understand something that I never found the courage to tell you while I was alive. Daniel paused, his voice catching slightly before he continued. When you came home from your first deployment, different than when you left, I saw myself in you. I saw the weight you were carrying, the responsibility you felt for every Marine under your command, the way you blamed yourself for losses that were beyond your control. I recognized it because I carried the same weight for 32 years. The same guilt, the same sense of duty, the same understanding that some things are worth any sacrifice they demand. Rebecca's face was changing as Daniel read, the angry mask slipping to reveal something more vulnerable underneath. I never told you about Somalia, about the Navy Cross, about the nights I woke up screaming from nightmares about Marines I couldn't save. I never told you because I wanted to protect you from the knowledge that your mother was just as broken and scarred as any warrior who comes home from war. But now I realize that was a mistake. You needed to know that you weren't alone in carrying that burden. Daniel looked up at both of us before continuing. Rebecca, my beautiful daughter, I know you think I failed you by supporting Marcus's choice to serve. I know you believe I loved him more because I understood his path better. But love isn't about understanding. Love is about acceptance, about supporting the people we care about, even when their choices frighten us. I was afraid every single day that Marcus was deployed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I was terrified every time the phone rang, every time a news report mentioned casualties, every time months passed without word. But I was also proud, prouder than I ever found the words to express. The silence that followed was complete, broken only by the sound of wind through the maple trees and the distant hum of traffic on Main Street. Rebecca's face was streaked with tears she'd been holding back for days, her carefully constructed anger crumbling in the face of Mom's final words. She asked me to give you both something else, Daniel said quietly. He reached into his other pocket and pulled out 2 small boxes. She's been carrying these for 15 years, waiting for the right time. He handed me the first box. Inside, nestled in faded blue velvet, was Mom's Navy Cross, the medal she'd earned in Somalia for saving 14 Marines under enemy fire. The inscription on the back read, "For Marcus, who inherited more than my stubbornness. Love, Mom." Rebecca's box contained something different. A small silver locket that had belonged to our grandmother, the woman who'd raised Mom after her own father died in Vietnam. Inside the locket was a photo of all 3 of us as children, arms wrapped around each other, laughing at something long forgotten. The inscription read, "For Rebecca, who inherited my fierce love for family. Some bonds can't be broken by distance or time or even death. Love, Mom." Rodriguez stepped forward, his voice gentle but firm. "Ma'am, your brother served with honor, but so did your mother. Today isn't about choosing between military service and family love. Today is about honoring a woman who gave everything to both." Rebecca looked at the locket in her hands, then at me, standing in my dress blues, surrounded by Marines who'd come to honor a woman they'd served with decades before I was even born. For the first time in 3 years, I saw my sister instead of my adversary. "I'm sorry," she whispered, so quietly I almost didn't hear her. "I'm sorry, Marcus. I was so angry about losing you to the military that I forgot we both lost Mom to grief and fear and worry. I blamed you for her pain when I should have blamed the circumstances that made service necessary in the first place." The chapel bells began to chime, calling us to the memorial service that was about to begin. Rodriguez nodded to his Marines, who stepped aside to create a path to the chapel doors. But before I moved, I reached out and took Rebecca's hand. "We both loved her," I said simply. "That's what matters now." Together, the 3 of us walked through the chapel doors, past the security guard, who no longer seemed necessary. past the relatives who'd been holding their breath waiting for the confrontation to explode into something uglier. The Marines followed behind us, their presence, a reminder that some honors transcend family disputes, that some services deserve recognition regardless of the cost they exact from those left behind. As we took our seats in the front pew, Rebecca reached over and placed her hand on top of mine. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. It wasn't the complete healing of 15 years of resentment and misunderstanding. But it was a beginning, a recognition that grief shared is easier to bear than grief carried alone. The service was beautiful, filled with stories of Mom's compassion, her dedication to healing, her quiet strength in the face of loss. When it came time for military honors, Rodriguez and his Marines performed the ceremony with precision and dignity that would have made Mom proud. As taps played and the flag was folded, I realized that this wasn't just about honoring a fallen veteran. It was about understanding that love takes many forms, that service comes in many shapes, and that families can be broken and mended and broken again, without ever losing the foundation of care that holds them together. After the service, as people filed out offering condolences and sharing memories, Rebecca stayed beside me. We didn't talk much, but we didn't need to. Sometimes healing begins not with words, but with presence, with the simple decision to stay in the same space long enough for understanding to take root. Rodriguez approached us as we stood by Mom's memorial photo, a picture of her in dress uniform that I'd never seen before. "She was proud of you both," he said simply. Every time I talked to her over the years, she talked about her children, the son who served with honor, the daughter who built a life of stability and love, the son who taught the next generation. She never saw your choices as competition with each other. She saw them as different expressions of the values she tried to teach you. That evening, the three of us sat on the porch of our childhood home, sharing memories and filling in the gaps that distance and resentment had created over the years. Daniel told stories about Mom's quiet acts of service in the community, the veterans she'd helped transition to civilian life, the families she'd supported through their own deployments. Rebecca shared memories of Mom's fierce protectiveness, the way she'd fought school administrators and insurance companies, and anyone else who threatened her children's well-being. And I told them about the conversations Mom and I had shared during my deployments, the way she'd listened without judgment to stories I couldn't tell anyone else, the strength she'd given me when the weight of command threatened to crush my spirit. We realized that we'd each known a different version of the same woman, and that all of those versions were true. Mom the warrior, Mom the healer, Mom the fierce protector, Mom the patient listener. She'd been all of those things because love required her to be, because the people she cared about needed different aspects of her strength at different times. As the sun set over Cedar Falls, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that reminded me of sunsets in Afghanistan, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Peace. Not the absence of conflict, but the presence of understanding. The knowledge that families can survive anything if they remember that love is stronger than resentment, that forgiveness is more powerful than anger, and that some bonds truly can't be broken by distance or time or even death. Mom was gone, but the values she'd instilled in us, the love she'd shown us, the example she'd set through 32 years of service, and a lifetime of putting others before herself, those things remained. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was everything. 3 months after Mom's memorial service, I found myself standing in the same chapel where 12 Marines had escorted me past my sister's anger and into a moment of grace that changed everything. This time, the circumstances were different. The chapel was decorated with white lilies and soft candlelight, and instead of mourning clothes, the gathered crowd wore their Sunday best. Daniel's oldest daughter, Emma, was getting confirmed, and for the first time in 15 years, all 3 Sullivan siblings sat together in the same pew. Rebecca sat to my right, her hand resting on my arm in a gesture that had become natural over the past months. Tom sat beside her, and their twin boys fidgeted in their seats, occasionally whispering questions about why Uncle Marcus had so many medals on his chest. To my left, Daniel beamed with pride as his daughter stood before the altar, her young voice clear and confident, as she recited the vows that would formally welcome her into the church community. Watching Emma speak about commitment, about choosing to dedicate her life to something larger than herself, I was struck by how much she reminded me of Mom at that age. The same determined set to her jaw, the same fearless directness when speaking about things that mattered to her. After the ceremony, as families gathered in the fellowship hall for refreshments and congratulations, Emma found me by the coffee table. "Uncle Marcus," she said, tugging on my dress blue jacket, "Mom told me you knew Grandma better than anyone. Is it true she was a real soldier like you?" I knelt down to meet her eyes. This 12-year-old who was trying to understand the complicated legacy of a grandmother she'd barely known. She was more than a soldier, Emma. She was a healer. She spent her whole life trying to fix what war broke, trying to help people who were hurt find their way home. Emma nodded seriously, processing this information with the gravity that children bring to important topics. "Dad says she would have been proud of me today. Do you think that's true?" The question hit me harder than I expected. I thought about Mom sitting in this same fellowship hall years ago, watching me graduate from high school, her face glowing with pride even though she knew I was about to leave for the Marines. I thought about all the moments she'd missed because of her own service, all the ceremonies and celebrations she'd attended through letters and phone calls, instead of being physically present. "I know it's true," I told Emma. "Your grandmother understood better than anyone what it means to make a commitment and keep it, even when it's hard. She would see herself in you today." As the afternoon wore on, I found myself in conversations I couldn't have imagined 3 months earlier. Rebecca's friends approached me with genuine curiosity about military life, asking thoughtful questions about deployment experiences and veteran transition challenges. Tom, my brother-in-law, who'd been politely distant for years, pulled me aside to share stories about his grandfather's service in World War II, connections he'd never felt comfortable making before. But the most significant conversation happened with Rebecca herself, later that evening as we sat on Daniel's back porch watching the kids play in the yard. She'd changed from her church dress into jeans and a sweater, and for the first time since I'd known her as an adult she looked relaxed, unguarded. "I've been thinking about what Mom wrote in that letter," she said, her voice quiet enough that the children couldn't overhear. "About love being acceptance rather than understanding. I realized I spent so many years trying to make you choose between military service and family love, when the choice was never yours to make. It was mine. I could choose to accept who you were, or I could choose to resent who you weren't." I watched her sons chase Daniel's kids around the swing set, their laughter carrying across the yard like music. "You weren't wrong about the cost, Rebecca. Military families do sacrifice things that civilian families don't. Mom did worry about me in ways that affected her health, her happiness, her peace of mind. That's on me too." She shook her head firmly. "No, that's on the world that makes military service necessary. That's on the circumstances that require some people to carry burdens others don't. But it's not on you for answering that call, and it's not on Mom for raising a son who understood what duty meant." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, both of us wrestling with years of accumulated misunderstanding that couldn't be resolved in a single conversation. Finally, Rebecca spoke again. "I want to do something to honor Mom's military service, something public, something that recognizes what she contributed. I've been talking to the people at the VA hospital where she worked, and they're interested in creating a memorial garden. Somewhere peaceful where veterans can go when they need to remember that healing is possible." The idea surprised me, not because it wasn't fitting, but because it represented such a complete transformation in how Rebecca viewed Mom's military identity. "What changed your mind about celebrating her service?" She smiled, and for a moment I saw the sister I'd grown up with, before deployment cycles and family resentment had built walls between us. "Master Sergeant Rodriguez changed my mind. After the memorial service, he told me stories about Mom that I'd never heard. Not just about Somalia, but about all the times she went above and beyond to take care of people who were broken by war. He said she had a gift for seeing past the wounds to the person underneath, for believing in recovery, even when everyone else had given up hope." I thought about the veterans Mom had brought home for Thanksgiving dinners when I was young, men and women who had nowhere else to go, who needed family more than they needed privacy. I remembered how she'd never made a big deal about their presence, never treated them like charity cases, just set extra places at the table and made sure everyone felt welcome. "Rodriguez said something else that stuck with me," Rebecca continued. He said Mom never talked about her medals or her commendations, but she talked constantly about her children, about how proud she was of all three of us, about how each of us had found different ways to serve others. You through military leadership, Daniel through education, me through helping families find homes. He said she saw all of those things as different expressions of the same values. The revelation shifted something fundamental in my understanding of our family dynamic. I'd always assumed Mom's support of my military career meant she valued my choices over my siblings' paths. But maybe that had never been true. Maybe she'd simply recognized that each of us needed different kinds of encouragement, different forms of validation. I want you to help design the memorial garden, Rebecca said. You knew her as a veteran in ways Daniel and I couldn't. You understand what kinds of spaces bring peace to people who've seen combat. And I think working on it together might help us figure out how to be siblings again, instead of strangers who happen to share the same parents. Over the following months, the Memorial Garden project became a bridge that connected our different perspectives on Mom's legacy. Rebecca handled the fundraising and community outreach with the same efficiency she brought to her real estate career. Daniel organized educational components, reaching out to local schools to create programs that would teach students about military service and veteran transition challenges. And I worked with landscape architects and veteran organizations to design spaces that would provide different kinds of healing for different kinds of wounds. The garden took shape slowly, thoughtfully. We included a meditation area surrounded by native Michigan plants, a walking path that wound through displays highlighting different aspects of military service, and a central memorial wall engraved with Mom's Navy Cross citation and the names of other local veterans who'd made significant sacrifices for their communities. But the most meaningful part of the project wasn't the physical space we were creating. It was the conversations that happened during planning meetings, the stories that emerged as we interviewed other veterans about what they needed from a healing space, the gradual reconstruction of our relationship as we worked toward a common goal that honored Mom's memory while addressing real needs in our community. 6 months after the memorial service, Daniel called me with news that shifted everything again. He'd been going through Mom's personal effects, items that had been stored in the attic since her death, when he discovered a wooden box hidden behind Christmas decorations. You need to see this, Marcus, he told me, his voice carrying an excitement I hadn't heard since we were children. Mom kept everything. Every letter you sent from deployment, every newspaper clipping that mentioned your unit, every photo from military ceremonies. But there's more. There are letters from Marines you served with, letters from families of soldiers she treated, letters from people whose lives she touched in ways we never knew about. When I arrived at the family house that evening, Daniel had spread the contents of the box across the dining room table like a museum exhibit. Letters, photos, official documents, personal mementos, a complete record of Mom's military life and its ongoing impact on the people she'd served alongside. One letter particularly caught my attention. It was from a Marine named Jennifer Santos, dated just 2 months before Mom died. Dear Maria, it read, I know it's been 15 years since you saved my life in that field hospital in Somalia, but not a day goes by that I don't think about the woman who held my hand while the doctors worked to stop the bleeding, who promised me I would make it home to see my daughter again. You were right, I did make it home. My daughter graduated from college last month, and as I watched her walk across that stage, I thought about how none of it would have been possible without your skill, your compassion, your refusal to give up on a scared 20-year-old Marine who was sure she was going to die in a foreign country. The letter went on to describe Santos's successful career as a nurse, inspired by Mom's example, and her work with veteran transition programs. It ended with a promise to honor Mom's memory by continuing to help other veterans find their way back to wholeness after war. Rebecca found us both crying over the letters, and without saying a word, she sat down and began reading them too. For the next 3 hours, we discovered pieces of our mother's life that none of us had known existed. Stories of lives saved, careers inspired, families held together during deployment separations, communities strengthened by her quiet acts of service. She never told us about any of this, Rebecca said wonderingly, holding a photo of Mom surrounded by a group of young soldiers at a field hospital in Kuwait. All these people she helped, all these lives she touched, and she never once bragged about it or asked for recognition. Daniel picked up a stack of letters from Gold Star families. Parents who'd lost children in combat but wrote to thank Mom for the care she'd provided during their loved ones' final moments. "She carried all of this alone," he said quietly. "All these connections, all this responsibility, all this grief and joy and pride. And she never burdened us with the weight of it." As we sorted through the documents, a picture emerged of a woman whose service extended far beyond her official military duties. Mom had maintained relationships with hundreds of people she'd served alongside, had attended graduations and weddings and funerals for families connected to her through shared experiences of war and healing. She'd created an informal network of support that had touched lives across decades and continents. The discovery transformed our understanding of the Memorial Garden Project. What we'd conceived as a tribute to one local veteran became something larger. A recognition of the invisible threads that connect military families across generations and geography. We expanded the design to include space for rotating displays featuring stories from the larger military community. Areas where visiting veterans could share their own experiences and find connection with others who understood their journey. When the garden was finally completed, 18 months after Mom's death, the dedication ceremony drew people from across the Midwest. Master Sergeant Rodriguez brought a delegation of Marines who'd served with Mom in various capacities. Jennifer Santos flew in from California to speak about Mom's impact on her life and career. Dozens of other veterans, some we'd never met, came to pay respects to a woman whose quiet service had rippled outward in ways we were still discovering. As I stood before the gathered crowd, wearing my dress blues for what I knew would be one of the last times, I thought about the journey that had brought us to this moment. The anger and resentment that had nearly destroyed our family. The healing that had begun with 12 Marines marching down Maple Street. The discoveries that had revealed the depth and breadth of our mother's legacy. "My mother believed that service takes many forms," I said, looking out at faces that represented decades of military experience and civilian support. "She believed that healing was possible, that broken things could be made whole, that love was stronger than loss. This garden exists because she was right about all of those things." After the ceremony, as people wandered through the paths Mom had helped inspire, Rebecca found me sitting on a bench near the memorial wall. The late afternoon sun filtered through the maple trees we'd planted in honor of military families, casting dancing shadows across the engraved names of local veterans. "Do you think she would be proud of what we've built here?" Rebecca asked, settling beside me on the bench. I thought about the letters hidden in that attic box, the lives touched by Mom's quiet service, the healing that had taken place within our own family over the past year and a half. I think she'd be proud that we finally learned how to work together instead of against each other. I think she'd be proud that we found a way to honor service while acknowledging its cost. Rebecca nodded, then reached into her purse and pulled out a small wrapped package. "I have something for you. Something I should have given you months ago." Inside the package was a simple silver chain holding Mom's dog tags, worn smooth by decades of wear. On the back of one tag, someone had engraved a single word in Mom's handwriting: home. "She wore these every day until she died," Rebecca said softly. "Even after she retired, even after she'd spent years working as a civilian nurse. The funeral director gave them to me, and I kept them because I was angry, because I thought I was the one who'd stayed home while you went away. But I realize now that home isn't a place you stay. Home is what you carry with you, what you fight to protect, what you work to build for the people you love." I fastened the chain around my neck, feeling the weight of Mom's tags settle against my chest. They were warm from Rebecca's touch, charged with years of memories and meaning I was still learning to understand. As the sun set over the memorial garden, painting the sky in shades that reminded me of deployment sunsets halfway around the world, I felt something I'd been searching for since the day I enlisted 20 years earlier. Not just peace, but belonging. Not just forgiveness, but understanding. Not just healing, but hope. Mom had been right about many things, but she'd been most right about this. Some bonds truly can't be broken by distance or time, or even death. Love finds a way to survive, to grow, to transform pain into purpose and loss into legacy. And sometimes, if we're patient enough and brave enough and willing to do the hard work of rebuilding what's been broken, we discover that coming home isn't about returning to a place we left behind. Coming home is about creating something new, something better, something worthy of the sacrifices that made it possible. 2 years after the Memorial Garden dedication, I found myself standing in a place I never expected to be, the principal's office of Cedar Falls Elementary School. Not as a student in trouble or a parent with concerns, but as the newly hired director of the school district's veteran education program, a position created specifically to bridge the gap between military experience and civilian community service. The job offer had come through Daniel, who'd spent months working with the school board to develop a program that would bring veteran perspectives into classrooms, while providing meaningful employment for transitioning service members. When he first mentioned the opportunity, I laughed and told him I was better suited for leading Marines than teaching third graders. But something about the idea wouldn't let go of me. "You've spent 20 years training people to handle life or death situations," Daniel had argued during one of our monthly dinners at the family house. "Teaching kids about resilience, leadership, and service to community should be easy by comparison." He wasn't wrong, but he wasn't entirely right either. Working with children required a different kind of patience, a gentler approach to authority, and the ability to translate complex concepts about duty and sacrifice into language that 8-year-olds could understand and apply to their own lives. My first day on the job, I walked into Mrs. Patterson's 4th grade classroom wearing civilian clothes that still felt foreign after 2 decades in uniform. 28 pairs of curious eyes stared at me as I introduced myself, and I realized I was more nervous than I'd been during my first combat patrol in Afghanistan. "Mr. Sullivan is here to tell us about being a Marine," Mrs. Patterson announced, and immediately hands shot up around the room. "Did you ever shoot anyone?" asked a boy named Tyler, his question delivered with the casual directness that only children possess. "Did you get scared?" asked a girl named Sarah, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Why did you want to be a soldier?" asked another student, and I found myself thinking about how to answer questions I'd never been asked so directly before. I spent the next hour talking about teamwork, about taking care of the people beside you, about the difference between courage and fearlessness. I told them about the Marines I had served with, focusing on stories of heroism and sacrifice that didn't include details too heavy for young minds to carry. And I watched as concepts that seemed abstract to adults became concrete and understandable when filtered through children's natural sense of fairness and protection. When the class ended, Tyler approached my desk with a drawing he'd made during my presentation. It showed stick figures in military uniforms helping each other over obstacles, with a caption that read, "Marines take care of Marines." Below that, in cragged kindergarten handwriting, he'd added, "Like how my dad takes care of me." That drawing, which I kept framed on my office wall, became a daily reminder of why the work mattered. These children weren't learning about military service because they needed to become soldiers. They were learning about service because they needed to become citizens, community members, people who understood that taking care of each other wasn't just a military value, but a human necessity. The program expanded quickly. Within 6 months, I was visiting classrooms across the district, working with teachers to develop curriculum units that connected military history to current events, leadership principles to classroom management, and service ethics to community involvement. But the most meaningful part of the job wasn't the formal presentations. It was the individual conversations that happened afterward. When students approached me with questions about courage, about making difficult choices, about what it meant to dedicate your life to something larger than yourself. One afternoon, a 5th grader named Maria stayed after class to show me a letter she'd written to her uncle, who was deployed overseas. She'd never met him because he'd enlisted before she was born, but she'd heard her family talking about him in hushed tones, the same way my family had talked about my deployments. "I wanted to tell him that someone at home is proud of him," she explained, her voice serious beyond her years. "My mom says he's different now, that war changed him. But you seem okay, so maybe he'll be okay too." I helped her revise the letter, and we mailed it together. 3 weeks later, she brought me his response. A carefully written thank you note that expressed gratitude not just for her words of support, but for the understanding that someone back home was trying to learn about his experience. Maria's uncle wrote that receiving a letter from a child who'd been taught to see military service as both sacrifice and honor had reminded him why his deployment mattered. These moments accumulated into something larger than individual interactions. The veteran education program became a bridge between two communities that had often existed in parallel without truly connecting. Students began bringing their grandparents to school events. Elderly veterans who shared stories from Korea and Vietnam with children who'd previously known military history only through textbooks. Parents started asking questions about how they could support military families in their community, leading to volunteer initiatives that provided everything from deployment care packages to lawn care for families dealing with injuries or transition challenges. But the program's impact extended beyond the school walls. Other districts began requesting information about replicating our curriculum. State education officials visited to observe classes and interview teachers about integrating military perspectives into broader discussions about citizenship and community service. What had started as a local initiative designed to provide meaningful work for one transitioning veteran became a model for similar programs across Michigan and eventually other states. The professional recognition was gratifying, but the personal transformation was more significant. For the first time since leaving the Marines, I felt like I was using my military experience in service of something constructive, rather than simply carrying it as a burden. The leadership skills, the ability to remain calm under pressure, the understanding of how teams function under stress, all of these capabilities found new purpose in civilian contexts that needed exactly those kinds of perspectives. Rebecca noticed the change during one of our regular coffee meetings at the cafe downtown, a weekly tradition that had developed as we worked through years of accumulated misunderstanding and rebuilt our relationship as adults. "You look different," she observed, studying my face across the small table we'd claimed as our usual spot. "More settled, more like yourself than I've seen you since you came home." She was right, though I struggled to articulate exactly what had shifted. "I think I'm finally figuring out how to be a veteran instead of just an ex-Marine," I said. "There's a difference between ending something and beginning something new." Rebecca nodded, understanding immediately. Her own transition had been less dramatic but equally significant. The Memorial Garden project had sparked an interest in community development that led her to specialize in helping veteran families find housing, using her real estate expertise to connect military families with resources and support systems that made civilian transition easier. "Tom thinks I've become obsessed with military families," she said with a laugh. "Last month I spent 4 hours helping a Navy couple understand school district boundaries because I wanted to make sure their kids ended up in classrooms with teachers who understand deployment cycles." This wasn't obsession, I realized. This was Rebecca discovering that her professional skills could serve purposes beyond profit, that her understanding of family dynamics and community resources could help other people navigate challenges she'd watched our family struggle with for years. Daniel had experienced a similar transformation. His work as a teacher had always included informal mentorship of students from military families. But Mom's death and the Memorial Garden project had made him more intentional about addressing the unique needs of children dealing with deployment separations, parent injuries, and the complex emotions that come with loving someone who serves in dangerous situations. "I've started a support group for kids with deployed parents," he told me during one of our monthly family dinners. "Just an hour after school once a week, but it's amazing how much they need to talk to other children who understand why their mom or dad isn't at the soccer game or school play." The group had grown from 5 students to nearly 20 in just one semester, drawing children from across the district who needed space to express feelings that their civilian friends couldn't fully comprehend. Daniel brought in guest speakers, organized pen pal programs with deployed service members, and created projects that helped military children feel pride in their family's service, while acknowledging the real challenges that service created for daily life. These individual transformations reflected something larger happening in Cedar Falls. The Memorial Garden had become more than a tribute to Mom's service. It had become a gathering place for the veteran community, a space where military families could connect with each other and with civilians who wanted to understand and support their experiences. Every Memorial Day and Veterans Day, the garden hosted ceremonies that drew hundreds of participants. But the more meaningful events happened throughout the year. Informal gatherings where veterans shared stories, support group meetings for military spouses, educational programs that brought school groups to learn about military history and current veteran issues. 3 years after Mom's death, Master Sergeant Rodriguez called me with an invitation that brought everything full circle. The Marine Corps was hosting a ceremony to posthumously award Mom the Legion of Merit, recognizing her contributions to military medicine and veteran care that had extended far beyond her official service record. They want to present the medal to her family at the Memorial Garden, Rodriguez explained. It seems fitting, given what you've all built there in her honor. The ceremony took place on a crisp October morning, exactly 3 years after the memorial service, where 12 Marines had escorted me past Rebecca's anger and into a moment of grace that changed our family's trajectory. This time, Rebecca stood beside me as the citation was read, her hand resting on my arm in a gesture of support that had become natural over the years of rebuilding our relationship. The Legion of Merit citation described Mom's service in clinical terms, her innovations in field medical procedures, her mentorship of junior medical personnel, her contributions to veteran transition programs. But, as I listened to the official language, I thought about the letters we'd found in her attic, the personal testimonies from Marines and soldiers whose lives she'd touched, the informal network of support she'd maintained for decades after her official retirement. After the ceremony, as family and friends gathered in the Memorial Garden for refreshments and conversation, I found myself talking with Jennifer Santos, the Marine whose letter had first revealed the scope of Mom's impact on individual lives. "Your mother saved more than my life that day in Somalia," Santos told me, her voice carrying the weight of 30 years of gratitude. "She saved my ability to believe that people could be fundamentally good, even in the worst circumstances. That belief shaped every choice I made afterward, every patient I treated, every student I taught." Santos had become a nursing instructor at a major medical school, specializing in trauma care and military medicine. She trained hundreds of medical professionals over the years, always emphasizing the importance of seeing patients as whole human beings rather than just medical cases. She traced that philosophy directly to watching Mom work in field conditions, treating wounded Marines with a combination of technical skill and personal compassion that had left lasting impressions on everyone who witnessed it. "She never knew the ripple effect of what she did," Santos continued. "Every nurse I trained who went on to treat veterans with dignity and understanding, every medical professional who learned to see past the symptoms to the person underneath, that's part of her legacy too." The conversation reminded me of something I'd learned through the veteran education program. Impact isn't always immediate or visible. Sometimes the most important work happens in small interactions that plant seeds in unexpected places, growing into changes that only become apparent years or decades later. That evening, after the ceremony guests had departed and the formal presentations had ended, the 3 Sullivan siblings sat together in the Memorial Garden as the sun set through the maple trees we'd planted to honor military families. It had become a tradition, these quiet moments after significant events, when we processed experiences together instead of retreating to separate corners to nurse individual wounds or celebrations. "I keep thinking about what Santos said about ripple effects," Rebecca mused, her voice thoughtful in the gathering dusk. "About how Mom never knew how far her influence extended, how many lives she touched indirectly through the people she helped directly." Daniel nodded, pulling his jacket closer against the October chill. "It makes me wonder what ripple effects we're creating now, through the garden, through the education program, through all the ways we've learned to honor her memory by serving other people." The question stayed with me as weeks turned into months, and the Memorial Garden continued to draw visitors from across the region. Veterans brought their families to walk the paths and read the memorial wall. Students from colleges and high schools came to research projects about military service and civilian support. Community groups used the space for meetings and events that brought together people who might not otherwise have opportunities to understand each other's experiences. I began to see these interactions as part of a larger pattern, the same kind of network that Mom had created through her decades of service. Each conversation between a veteran and a civilian, each moment when a child learned to see military service as both sacrifice and honor, each connection made between military families and their broader communities, all of these represented threads in a web of understanding that could strengthen the fabric of democracy itself. The realization shifted my perspective on the work I was doing through the veteran education program. Teaching children about military service wasn't just about honoring veterans or preserving military history. It was about preparing future citizens to understand that democracy requires active participation, that freedom depends on people being willing to serve something larger than their own immediate interests, that healthy communities need members who understand both the costs and the benefits of collective responsibility. This understanding deepened when I received a letter from Tyler, the fourth grader who'd drawn the picture of Marines helping each other. He was in high school now, and he'd joined the debate team, where he'd given a speech about civilian-military relations that won a state competition. "I've been thinking about what you taught us about service," he wrote. "How it doesn't always mean joining the military, but it always means taking care of other people. I want to be a teacher like your brother Daniel, so I can help kids understand that they're part of something bigger than just themselves." The letter arrived on the same day I received notification that the Veteran Education Program had been selected for a national award recognizing innovative approaches to citizenship education. The timing felt symbolic, a reminder that individual impact and institutional recognition were connected but not identical, that the work mattered regardless of whether it received formal acknowledgement. Standing in the memorial garden that evening, reading Tyler's letter by the light of the memorial wall's eternal flame, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. From the angry confrontation outside St. Catherine's Chapel to the peaceful certainty of purpose I felt now, the path had been marked by discoveries about love, service, forgiveness, and the patient work of rebuilding what seemed irreparably broken. Mom had been right about many things, but perhaps most importantly, she'd been right about the nature of service itself. It wasn't something you did for recognition or gratitude, though both were welcome when they came. It wasn't something you did to prove your worth or earn your place in community, though it often had those effects. Service was something you did because it needed to be done, because other people mattered, because the alternative to caring for each other was a kind of spiritual and social death that diminished everyone it touched. As I folded Tyler's letter and placed it in my jacket pocket, next to the dog tags Rebecca had returned to me years earlier, I felt the weight of responsibility that came with understanding this truth. Not the crushing weight I'd carried as a young Marine leader, afraid of making mistakes that could cost lives, but the sustaining weight of purpose that comes from knowing your work matters, that your choices have consequences beyond your own immediate circumstances. The memorial garden had become more than a tribute to one veteran's service. It had become a symbol of what was possible when people chose connection over division, understanding over judgment, healing over revenge. The Veteran Education Program had become more than a job for one transitioning Marine. It had become a bridge between military and civilian communities that had often existed in parallel without truly understanding each other. And our family had become more than the collection of wounded, resentful individuals we'd been in the aftermath of loss and separation. We'd become a demonstration that broken things could be repaired, that love could survive anger and distance and even death, that forgiveness was not just possible but necessary for anyone who wanted to live fully rather than simply survive. Walking home through the quiet streets of Cedar Falls, past houses where military families and civilian families lived side by side, where children played together without understanding the artificial divisions that adults sometimes created between different kinds of service, I felt something I'd been searching for since the day I first put on a Marine uniform: complete integration of who I was, who I had been, and who I was becoming. The work would continue. There would be more students to teach, more veterans to support, more bridges to build between communities that needed each other more than they realized. There would be setbacks and frustrations, moments when progress seemed impossible and understanding felt out of reach. But there would also be breakthrough moments like Tyler's letter, like Santos's testimony, like the quiet evening conversations in the memorial garden, when siblings learned to see each other clearly for the first time in decades. Mom had given us more than her service record and her medals and her example of dedication to duty. She had given us a template for how to live with purpose, how to transform personal experience into community benefit, how to turn individual healing into collective strength. The lesson had taken years to fully understand, and it would take a lifetime to fully implement. But it was enough to build a life on, enough to justify the sacrifices that had made it possible, enough to pass on to the next generation of children who needed to understand that they too were part of something larger than themselves. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.